The massive metal walls of Kepler Station stretched out in all directions like a small city floating in space. Thousands of ships from dozens of different worlds docked at its ports every day. The station served as neutral ground where alien species could meet and trade without fear of war breaking out. Today was special, though, because the annual Warriors trial was about to begin. General Vextel stood on the observation deck overlooking the main arena. His forearms crossed behind his back as he watched the preparations below. The Kralix general was an impressive sight even among his own people. Standing nearly 9 feet tall with dark green scales covering his body and sharp spines running down his back, he commanded respect wherever he went. His crystalline armor caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the nearby walls. The arena itself was a circular space about 200 feet across with smooth metal floors and energy barriers that could absorb most weapon strikes. Seats rose up in tiers around the fighting area, and today they were packed with representatives from every major species in the galaxy. The Warriors' trial happened only once a year, and everyone wanted to see which species would prove themselves the strongest. Vextel had been attending these trials for over 20 years. He had seen the massive Gorvani warriors with their natural armor plating crush opponents with their bare hands. He had watched the shadow-walking Nekmori appear and disappear, like ghosts while striking down enemies who never saw them coming. The telepathic Xanthari could overwhelm minds with pure psychic force. Every species brought their best, and every species had some natural advantage that made them dangerous in combat. The Kralix Empire had won the trial 15 times in the past 20 years. This was no surprise to anyone who understood warfare. The Kralix were born warriors with superior strength, speed, and intelligence. They had conquered 12-star systems through military might and tactical brilliance. Vextel himself had led the conquest of 3 of those systems. General, Commander Zektar approached from behind. The smaller Kralix officer carried a data pad with information about today's participants. The final roster has been confirmed. We have representatives from 18 different species. Vextel glanced at the list without much interest. He had seen it all before. Any new faces this year? Actually, yes, sir. There's one species that was not present last year. The humans have sent a delegation. This caught Vextel's attention slightly. He had heard of humans, but had never seen one in person. They were a newly discovered species from a single star system on the outer rim of the galaxy. 3 years ago, one of their primitive vessels had stumbled into Kralix space by accident. The encounter had been peaceful and first contact protocols were followed. Since then, the humans had been slowly introduced to galactic society. Humans, Vextel repeated the word as if tasting something unpleasant. I have read the reports. They are supposed to be quite weak physically. No natural armor, no enhanced strength, no special abilities of any kind. Why would they even bother entering the trial? Zektar shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps they do not understand what they are facing. The reports say they are still learning about other species. Down in the arena preparation area, Jake Morrison adjusted his gear one final time. The human marine stood 5 feet 8 inches tall with brown hair and green eyes. His body was lean and muscular from years of training, but he looked small compared to the other warriors preparing for combat. His equipment consisted of standard military fatigues, combat boots, and light protective gear. No fancy armor or energy. Weapons like some of the other species carried. Colonel Lisa Webb stood nearby reviewing the tournament rules on her tablet. She was the commanding officer of the human delegation and had been chosen to represent Earth at various galactic functions. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her blue eyes showed the kind of focus that came from years of military command. Remember, Jake, she said without looking up from her tablet, this is not just about winning or losing. This is about showing the galaxy what humans are capable of. Every species here will be watching and judging us based on your performance. Jake nodded and checked his gear one more time. He had volunteered for this assignment. When the call went out for a representative to the Warriors' trial, the human military had studied every available recording of past trials, and Jake had spent months preparing for this moment. He knew he was probably outmatched in terms of raw physical ability, but he had other advantages. "I understand, ma'am," he replied. "I will do my best to represent our species with honor." Captain Amy Foster approached them both. She served as the military attaché for human-alien relations and had been working with alien species longer than most humans. Her red hair and freckled face made her look younger than her 35 years, but her knowledge of alien cultures was extensive. "The opening ceremony is about to begin," she informed them. "Jake, you will be introduced fifth in the lineup. Remember that many of these species have never seen a human before, so there will be a lot of curiosity." Up in the observation deck, Vexthel watched as the participants were introduced to the crowd. Each warrior entered the arena to the cheers of their species supporters. The Gorvani berserker Grulfak drew loud roars from his people as he raised his massive fists in the air. The Vekmori shadow fighter Sulthara received respectful nods as she seemed to flicker in and out of visibility. The Zenthari warrior priest Morden caused several sensitive species to step back as psychic energy radiated from his presence. Then came the human's turn. Jake Morrison walked into the arena with steady steps. He did not roar or flex his muscles or demonstrate any special abilities. He simply walked to the center of the arena and stood at attention like a soldier on parade. The crowd grew quiet as they tried to figure out what they were looking at. Vexthel leaned forward slightly to get a better look. The human appeared to be one of the smallest participants in the trial. His skin looked soft and pale compared to the natural armor that most warrior species possessed. His equipment seemed primitive and basic. There were no visible weapons or special technology that might give him an advantage. "That is supposed to be a warrior?" Vexthel asked with amusement in his voice. The general began to chuckle as he watched the human stand calmly in the arena. Other alien dignitaries in the observation deck started to laugh as well. The idea that this small soft creature could compete with true warriors seemed absurd. "Look at it," Vexthel said to his aide. "It appears to be made of soft pink flesh, with no natural defenses at all. This should provide some entertainment before the real fighting begins." The laughter spread through the observation deck as more aliens noticed the human participant. Some species began placing bets on how quickly the human would be eliminated from the competition. The general consensus was that Jake Morrison would last less than 30 seconds against any serious opponent, but Jake seemed unaffected by the laughter and mockery. He stood in the arena with perfect military posture and waited for the competition to begin. His green eyes scanned the crowd and the other participants with the kind of calm assessment that came from professional training. The arena announcer began explaining the rules of combat. Each participant would face multiple opponents in single combat until only one remained. Weapons were allowed, but killing was forbidden. Victory came through knockout, submission, or judge's decision if the fight lasted too long. As the first matches were announced, Vexthel settled back in his chair to enjoy what he expected to be a brief and amusing display. The human would face a Gorvani berserker in the first round. It would be over quickly, and then the real tournament could begin. The general had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. The arena fell silent as Jake Morrison and Grulfak faced each other across the metal floor. The Gorvani berserker stood 8 feet tall with thick gray skin that looked like natural armor plating. His massive arms ended in fists that could crush steel, and his small red eyes burned with the fury of a creature born for war. Scars covered his body from countless battles, and his breathing sounded like a steam engine building pressure. Jake looked tiny in comparison. The human marine stood calmly with his hands at his sides and his feet planted in a basic fighting stance. He wore no armor except for light protective gear and carried no weapons. To most observers, he looked like he was about to be crushed by a freight train. General Vexthel leaned forward in his seat with anticipation. This would be over quickly, and then the real tournament could begin. Around him, other alien dignitaries placed last-minute bets on how long the human would last. The odds were not in Jake's favor. The arena announcer raised his hand and then dropped. it to signal the start of combat. Grulthak immediately let out a war cry that shook the walls of the arena. The sound was so loud that several smaller species in the audience covered their ears. The Gorvani berserker charged forward with his massive fists raised above his head. Jake did not charge back. Instead, he took 3 quick steps to his right and rolled forward as Grulthak's fists crashed into the metal floor where the human had been standing. The impact left deep dents in the supposedly indestructible arena surface. Sparks flew from the damaged metal as Grulthak straightened up and looked around for his opponent. The crowd began to laugh as Jake continued to move around the arena. To them, it looked like the human was running away from the fight. Several alien spectators started making jokes about human courage and calling Jake a coward. Even some of the other tournament participants joined in the mockery. Vexthel chuckled and shook his head. "Look how it scurries about like a frightened rodent," he said to his aide. "This is exactly what I expected from such a weak species." But Jake was not running away. He was studying his opponent with the trained eye of a professional soldier. As Grulthak charged again, Jake noticed that the berserker's left arm moved slightly slower than his right. There was also a small favoring of his right leg when he turned. Most importantly, the thick neck armor that protected the Gorvani's head also created a blind spot directly behind his left shoulder. Grulthak grew more frustrated as his attacks continued to miss their target. He began swinging wildly with both fists trying to catch the elusive human. His war cries grew louder and more frequent as his anger built. The crowd cheered for the berserker to finish off the human quickly. Jake continued his careful movement around the arena. He dodged another massive punch by inches and rolled under a sweeping backhand that would have taken his head off. Each time he avoided an attack, he made note of how Grulthak moved and where his weaknesses might be. After 5 minutes of what looked like one-sided pursuit, Jake suddenly changed tactics. As Grulthak charged forward again, the human did not dodge to the side. Instead, he dropped low and slid directly between the berserker's legs. As he passed under the massive alien, Jake drove his elbow into a pressure point just behind Grulthak's left knee. The effect was immediate. Grulthak's leg buckled and he stumbled forward, unable to stop his momentum. Jake used the opportunity to grab the berserker's right arm and use the alien's own charging motion to send him crashing into the arena wall. The impact was tremendous and the crowd gasped as pieces of metal wall plating fell to the floor, the laughter from the observation deck stopped abruptly. General Vexthel sat up straighter in his chair as he realized that the human had not been running away. He had been analyzing his opponent and waiting for the right moment to strike. Grulthak pulled himself away from the damaged wall with a roar of rage. His left leg was obviously bothering him, but he was far from defeated. The berserker turned toward Jake with murder in his small red eyes. This time his attack was more careful and controlled. The two fighters circled each other for several moments. Grulthak threw powerful but measured punches while Jake continued to dodge and weave. The human's movements were economical and precise. He never wasted energy on unnecessary motion and always seemed to be in the right position to avoid the berserker's attacks. Jake struck again when Grulthak overextended on a right cross. The human ducked under the punch and drove his fist into the berserker's solar plexus. The blow would have had little effect on the alien's armored hide, except Jake had studied Gorvani anatomy and knew exactly where to hit. His punch landed on a small gap between armor plates and drove the wind from Grulthak's lungs. The berserker staggered backward, gasping for air. Jake did not press his advantage immediately. Instead, he waited and watched as his opponent recovered. This was not cruelty, but tactical thinking. He was learning how quickly Grulthak could recover from different types of attacks. The fight continued for another 7 minutes with Jake using hit and run tactics. He would strike a weak point and then retreat before the berserker could retaliate. Each attack was precisely aimed at joints, pressure points, or gaps in the natural armor. None of the individual strikes were devastating, but they began to add up. Grulthak's movements became slower and more labored. His breathing was heavy and his attacks less coordinated. The berserker was getting tired while Jake seemed as fresh as when the fight started. The human's efficient fighting style preserved his energy, while forcing his opponent to waste theirs. The crowd had grown quiet as they realized. This was not the quick victory they had expected. The human was not just surviving against the powerful Gorvani warrior. He was winning. General Vexthal found himself leaning forward with genuine interest. Fascinating, he murmured. The creature is using the berserker's own strength against him. The end came suddenly. Grulthak made one final desperate charge with both arms spread wide to prevent Jake from escaping to either side. The human waited until the last possible moment and then dropped flat on his back. As the berserker passed over him, Jake grabbed Grulthak's ankle and twisted hard. The massive alien crashed to the arena floor with tremendous force. His head struck the metal surface and he lay still. The arena medical team rushed out to check on him, but it was clear that the fight was over. Grulthak was unconscious and would not be getting up. Jake stood slowly and walked to the center of the arena. He did not celebrate or show off to the crowd. He simply stood at attention and waited for the official result to be announced. The arena fell completely silent as the implications of what had just happened sank in. The human had defeated one of the tournament's most feared competitors. He had done it without superior strength or speed or any special abilities. He had won through technique, patience, and tactical thinking. Most disturbing of all, he had made it look easy. General Vexthal felt his amusement turn to something else. Curiosity mixed with the first stirrings of concern. If this human could defeat a Gorvani berserker, then perhaps there was more to this species than met the eye. The tournament officials announced Jake's victory and his next opponent. He would face a Zenthari warrior priest in the second round. The Zenthari possessed telepathic abilities that could overwhelm the minds of most species. Surely this would be where the human's luck ran out, but as Jake walked calmly back to his corner to prepare for the next fight, Vexthal found himself wondering if luck had anything to do with what he had just witnessed. The break between rounds lasted 30 minutes to allow fighters to rest and recover. Jake Morrison sat quietly in the human preparation area while Colonel Webb checked his condition. The Marine showed no signs of fatigue or injury from his fight with the Gorvani berserker. His breathing was steady and his movements remained fluid and controlled. "How do you feel?" Colonel Webb asked as she examined Jake's hands for any damage. "Good, ma'am," Jake replied simply. The berserker was strong, but predictable. His fighting style relied entirely on brute force with no tactical thinking. Captain Foster approached them with a tablet containing information about Jake's next opponent. Her expression was serious as she reviewed the data they had collected about the Zenthari species. "Your next fight will be much different," she informed. "Jake, the Zenthari warrior priest Morden possesses telepathic abilities. He can project fear directly into an opponent's mind or cause disorientation through psychic attacks. Most species find it impossible to fight effectively while under mental assault." Jake nodded as he absorbed this information. During his preparation for the tournament, he had studied every known alien species and their abilities. The Zenthari were one of the most dangerous opponents he might face because their attacks could not be blocked or dodged in the traditional sense. "What countermeasures do we have available?" he asked. Colonel Webb smiled slightly. "Remember your training at the Advanced Combat School? The mental discipline techniques they taught you for resisting interrogation should provide some protection against psychic attacks." Up in the observation deck, General Vexthal was having his own conversation with Commander Zektar. The Kralix general had requested all available information about human military capabilities from the station's database. What he found was disturbing. "These creatures have been fighting constantly for their entire recorded history," Vexthal muttered as he scrolled through the data. "Wars between their own species, conflicts with their environment, battles against disease and natural disasters. They never seemed to have a period of peace." The files showed that humans had developed warfare into a science. They studied every aspect of conflict from individual combat to large-scale strategy. Their military academies analyzed historical battles and developed new tactics constantly. Most concerning was their apparent obsession with preparing for opponents they had never faced. "General," Zektar said carefully. Perhaps we should pay closer attention to this tournament. The human's victory over Grothak was not accidental. Vexthal nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that his initial assessment of the human species had been wrong. They might appear weak physically, but they possessed something that most warrior species lacked. They treated warfare as an intellectual pursuit rather than just a test of strength. The arena announcer called for the second round to begin. Jake walked back onto the fighting floor to face his new opponent. Morden. The Zenthari warrior priest stood, 7 feet tall with pale blue skin and large black eyes that seemed to look through rather than at objects. His body was thin and appeared fragile, but the psychic energy radiating from him made sensitive species in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. The two fighters faced each other across the arena floor. Unlike the previous match, there was no immediate charge or display of aggression. Morden stood perfectly still with his arms at his sides and his dark eyes focused on Jake's face. The human marine maintained his ready stance and waited for the combat to begin. When the signal was given, Morden's attack was invisible but devastating. Waves of psychic energy crashed into Jake's mind like a tsunami. Images of terror and despair flooded his consciousness. The telepathic assault was designed to overwhelm the opponent's ability to think clearly or coordinate their movements. Jake staggered and put one hand to his head as the mental attack hit him. Several aliens in the crowd nodded knowingly. This was how fights against Zenthari warriors always went. The opponent would be paralyzed by fear and psychic pain within the first few seconds, but Jake did not fall. He took several deep breaths and began to recite something under his breath. The words were too quiet for most to hear, but they followed a pattern that military psychologists had developed for resisting mental manipulation. The technique involved focusing on concrete memories and facts to provide an anchor point for consciousness. General Vexthal watched with growing fascination as the human began to move forward despite the ongoing psychic assault. Morden's black eyes widened with surprise. His telepathic attacks were not having the expected effect on this strange opponent. Jake's advance was slow and unsteady at first. The psychic pressure made it difficult to maintain his balance and coordinate his movements. But with each step forward, his motion became more controlled. The mental discipline training was providing exactly the protection Captain Foster had hoped for. Morden increased the intensity of his psychic attacks. The telepathic warrior had never encountered an opponent who could resist his mental assault. For more than a few seconds, most fighters collapsed immediately under the weight of projected fear and despair. This human was not only staying conscious, but actually approaching him. The crowd watched in amazement as Jake continued his slow but steady advance across the arena floor. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated compared to his fight against the berserker, but he was still moving forward. The Zenthari's most powerful weapon was proving ineffective against human mental discipline. Jake reached striking distance and threw a clumsy punch that Morden easily avoided. The telepathic warrior was physically weak compared to most species, and relied entirely on his psychic abilities to incapacitate opponents before they could reach him. He had never needed to develop physical fighting skills. The human's second attack was more controlled than the first. His third was even better. With each passing moment, Jake seemed to be adapting to the psychic assault and regaining his coordination. The mental discipline techniques were not just protecting him from the telepathic attacks, but allowing him to function despite them. Morden began to back away from his advancing opponent. The Zenthari warrior had never been in a purely physical confrontation before. His species relied on psychic dominance to avoid hand-to-hand combat entirely. When that advantage was removed, he had no other skills to fall back on. Jake's breakthrough came when he managed to grab Morden's arm during an attempted strike. The physical contact seemed to disrupt the Zenthari's concentration, and the psychic assault weakened momentarily. Jake used that brief respite to land a solid punch to the alien's midsection. The telepathic warrior doubled over in pain. He had never experienced physical combat before, and the sensation was overwhelming. Jake followed up with a controlled takedown that brought Morden to the ground. The Zenthari warrior immediately submitted rather than continue the fight. The Arena fell silent as the implications of this second victory sank in. Jake had now defeated two opponents who represented completely different fighting styles. The Berserker's brute force approach and the warrior priest's psychic abilities were both ineffective against the human's methodical combat style. General Vextel found himself leaning forward with genuine interest. "Remarkable," he said to his aide. The creature adapted to a completely different type of attack within minutes of encountering it. Captain Foster had been watching the fight carefully, and she approached General Vextel during the next break between rounds. The human military attach had noticed the Kralix general's growing interest in Jake's performance. "General," she said diplomatically, "I noticed you have been observing our representative closely. If you have any questions about human combat techniques, I would be happy to discuss them." Vextel turned to face the human officer. She was much smaller than him, but carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. "I confess I am curious about your warrior's methods. He does not fight like any species I have encountered before." "That is because we approach combat differently than most species," Captain Foster replied. "We assume that any opponent might be stronger, faster, or possess abilities we do not have. Our training focuses on adaptation and problem-solving rather than relying on natural advantages." This explanation troubled Vextel more than he cared to admit. The Kralix Empire had built its military dominance on the assumption that superior physical capabilities would always triumph over inferior ones. The idea that a species could overcome natural disadvantages through training and tactics was unsettling. Jake's third opponent was announced as a Thekmori shadow fighter named Silthara. The crowd murmured with anticipation as they realized the human would now face an opponent who could become nearly invisible during combat. This seemed like an impossible challenge for any species that relied on traditional fighting methods, but as Jake walked back into the arena to face this new threat, General Vextel found himself wondering if impossible was a word that applied to this strange species called humanity. The arena had grown much quieter as Jake Morrison prepared for his third fight. Word was spreading throughout Kepler Station that something unusual was happening in the warrior's trial. The small human fighter had defeated two opponents who should have crushed him easily. Aliens who had never heard of humans before were now asking questions about this new species. Jake stood calmly in his corner while Colonel Webb made final checks of his equipment. The Marine showed no signs of fatigue. Despite having fought two difficult battles, his breathing remained steady and his movements were as controlled as when the tournament began. "The Thekmori will be your most challenging opponent yet," Colonel Webb warned him. "Their cloaking ability makes them nearly impossible to see during combat. Most fighters panic when they cannot locate their enemy." Jake nodded as he reviewed what he knew about Thekmori physiology and fighting techniques. The shadow fighters were tall and thin with natural camouflage abilities that allowed them to bend light around their bodies. In combat, they would become translucent and attack from unexpected angles. Traditional fighting methods were useless against an opponent you could not see. "How do we counter invisibility?" Jake asked. Captain Foster approached with additional tactical information. "Remember your training in night combat and fighting in zero visibility conditions. You learn to track enemies by sound, air movement, and other non-visual cues. Those same skills will apply here." Up in the observation deck, General Vextel was having a very different conversation with his staff. The Kralix general had spent the break between fights studying more human military files. What he discovered was deeply disturbing to someone who had built his career on conventional warfare. "Look at this training manual," Vextel said as he showed Commander Zektar a document on his tablet. "These humans practice fighting against opponents they have never encountered. They create simulated enemies with imaginary abilities and develop tactics to counter them." The files showed that human military academies regularly conducted exercises against hypothetical alien species. Soldiers trained to fight enemies who might be stronger, faster, telepathic, invisible, or possess any number of unknown abilities. The humans seemed to assume that they would always be at a disadvantage and prepared accordingly. They even have specific training for fighting invisible opponents. Zektar observed as he read over the documents. How could they know to prepare? For something like the Thekmori shadow fighters? Vexthal did not answer immediately. He was beginning to understand that human military thinking operated on principles that were foreign to most galactic species. Where other civilizations relied on natural advantages, humans assumed they had none and compensated through preparation and adaptability. The arena announcer called for the third round to begin. Jake walked onto the fighting floor to face his most unusual opponent yet. Sothara the Thekmori shadow fighter stood nearly 8 feet tall with pale gray skin and elongated limbs. Her movements were fluid and graceful like a dancer or acrobat. The two fighters faced each other across the arena. Sothara wore minimal clothing and carried no weapons. She did not need them when she could become invisible and strike from any direction. Her large silver eyes studied Jake with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. When the combat signal was given, Sothara immediately activated her cloaking ability. The Thekmori warrior seemed to fade away like smoke until only a faint shimmer in the air showed where she had been standing. Even that slight distortion was difficult to track as she began to move around the arena. The crowd expected this fight to end quickly. How could anyone battle an opponent they could not see? Most species would stand frozen in the center of the arena, waiting for an attack they could not predict or defend against. The Thekmori were considered one of the most dangerous warrior races specifically because of this advantage, but Jake did something unexpected. Instead of standing still and trying to track his invisible opponent, he closed his eyes completely. The human marine took a deep breath and shifted his stance slightly. He was no longer relying on sight to locate his enemy. General Vexthal leaned forward with intense interest. "What is the creature doing?" he asked aloud. Jake turned his head slowly from side to side as if listening for something. His hands remained in a ready position, but his movements were calm and controlled. He was using techniques developed for fighting in complete darkness, or when visual senses were compromised. Sothara moved closer to her opponent while maintaining her invisibility. The Thekmori fighter was confused by Jake's behavior but confident that her cloaking would provide an overwhelming advantage. She positioned herself for a strike from behind and slightly to the left, where most species had a blind spot. As Sothara launched her attack, Jake suddenly spun around and caught her arm mid-strike. The crowd gasped as the invisible warrior was revealed by the contact. Jake had somehow detected her approach despite her perfect camouflage. The Thekmori fighter tried to break free and reactivate her full cloaking, but Jake maintained his grip. He had learned from studying alien combat footage that Thekmori cloaking was less effective during physical exertion. The energy required to bend light around their bodies, while fighting reduced the quality of their invisibility. Sothara broke away and disappeared again, but now Jake knew how to find her. He listened for the slight sound of her breathing and the whisper of air displacement as she moved. When she approached for another attack, he was ready. His counter-strike caught her in the ribs and she stumbled backward, becoming visible again. The pattern repeated several times, with Jake using non-visual senses to track his cloaked opponent. Each time Sothara tried to use her invisibility advantage, Jake found a way to detect her position. The Thekmori warrior grew increasingly frustrated as her primary ability proved ineffective. The end came when Sothara made a desperate, all-out attack, hoping to overwhelm Jake through sheer aggression. But the human had been tracking her movement patterns and was ready for the assault. He sidestepped her charge and used her momentum to throw her into the arena wall. The impact left her stunned and unable to continue fighting. Jake opened his eyes as the fight was declared over. He had defeated another opponent who should have been impossible to beat using conventional methods. The arena fell silent as the implications of this third victory became clear. Captain Foster approached General Vexthal during the post-fight break. The human officer had noticed the Kralix general's intense interest in Jake's performance and decided to provide more information. "Your species prepares for everything," Vexthal observed when she joined him. "We have to," Captain Foster replied simply. "We are not the strongest or fastest or most naturally gifted species, but we are very good at learning and adapting to new situations. This conversation troubled Vexthal deeply. The Kralix Empire had conquered 12-star systems by assuming that superior, natural abilities would always triumph over inferior ones. The idea that preparation and training could overcome biological advantages challenged everything he believed about warfare. "How does your warrior know how to fight opponents he has never encountered before?" Vexthal asked. "Sergeant Morrison. Trained at our Combined Arms Academy," Captain Foster explained. "He studied every available recording of alien combat techniques and practiced against simulated opponents with various abilities. We may not know exactly what enemies we will face, but we prepare for as many possibilities as we can imagine." The implications of this statement hit Vexthal like a physical blow. The humans had been studying alien species and developing countermeasures before they ever entered galactic society. Jake Morrison had not stumbled into effective tactics by accident. He had trained specifically to fight Gorvani berserkers, Zemthari telepaths, and Ekmori shadow fighters. "You have been preparing to fight us," Vexthal said quietly. "We have been preparing to fight anyone who might threaten us," Captain Foster corrected. "It is simply good military practice to understand potential opponents and develop appropriate responses." The tournament's final match was announced as Jake prepared to face Warlord Krathson, General Vexthal's own champion. Krathson was considered the perfect Kralix warrior with superior strength, speed, natural armor, and 4 arms that could wield multiple weapons simultaneously. He had never been defeated in single combat, but as Jake walked back into the arena to face this ultimate challenge, General Vexthal found himself wondering if his champion was prepared to fight an opponent who had been training specifically to defeat Kralix warriors. The human had not just studied alien combat footage as an academic exercise. He had been preparing for war. The final match of the Warriors' trial was about to begin, and the atmosphere in the arena had changed completely from the morning's festivities. What had started as entertainment had become something much more serious. Jake Morrison had defeated 3 opponents in ways that challenged everything the galactic community thought they knew about warfare. Warlord Krathson entered the arena to thunderous applause from the Kralix delegation. The champion stood 9 feet tall with the classic 4-armed build of an elite Kralix warrior. His dark green scales were polished to a mirror shine, and his crystalline armor caught the arena lights like a prism. 4 energy weapons hung from his belt, and his movements showed the fluid grace of someone who had trained for combat since hatching. Jake walked to his position with the same calm demeanor he had shown throughout the tournament. The human marine looked even smaller next to the massive Kralix champion, but his confidence never wavered. He checked his gear one final time and settled into his ready stance. General Vexthal watched from the observation deck with emotions he had never experienced before. Pride in his champion mixed with genuine concern about the outcome. Krathson had never lost a fight and represented the pinnacle of Kralix military development. But the human had already proven that conventional thinking about combat effectiveness was wrong. "Krathson will not underestimate the human," Commander Zektar said as they watched the preparations below. "He has been studying the previous fights and adapting his tactics accordingly." Vexthal nodded but remained troubled. "That is exactly what concerns me. The human has been adapting as well, and he has shown an ability to counter every advantage his opponents possessed." When the combat signal was given, Krathson did not charge forward like the previous opponents had done. The Kralix champion had learned from watching Jake's earlier fights that the human excelled at turning an opponent's aggression against them. Instead, Krathson drew 2 energy weapons and began a careful advance. The first barrage of energy bolts forced Jake into immediate defensive action. The human rolled and dodged as purple energy blasts scorched the arena floor around him. Krathson's 4 arms allowed him to maintain continuous fire while adjusting his position. The energy weapons created a deadly web of crossfire that seemed impossible to escape. Jake found cover behind one of the arena's support pillars as energy bolts continued to rain down around him. The human was being forced into a purely defensive role for the first time in the tournament. Krathson's disciplined approach was denying him the opportunity to study his Opponents' movement patterns. The crowd cheered as the Kralix champion pressed his advantage. Many aliens who had bet against the human began to feel confident about their wagers. This looked like the kind of fight they had expected to see all day. A superior warrior using advanced tactics and superior equipment to dominate a weaker opponent, but Jake was not panicking despite the overwhelming firepower being directed at him. He was doing what humans did best under pressure. He was analyzing the situation and looking for weaknesses to exploit. The constant energy weapon fire was impressive, but it followed predictable patterns based on Kralix training doctrine. After 5 minutes of defensive action, Jake began to notice something important. Kratzon's four-armed coordination was actually creating brief moments of vulnerability. When the champion's upper arms crossed over his lower arms to target different areas, there was a split second where his fire pattern had gaps. Jake waited for the right moment and then sprinted from cover toward a different position. Kratzon adjusted his fire to track the moving target, but the human had timed his movement perfectly. He reached new cover just as the energy weapons recharged for another volley. General Vexthal leaned forward as he watched the human's movement. He is learning the firing patterns, he realized with growing unease. The pattern repeated several more times with Jake moving from cover to cover, while energy bolts filled the air around him. Each sprint was timed more precisely than the last. The human was not just surviving the barrage but actively studying it for weaknesses. Kratzon began to realize that his energy weapons were not providing the decisive advantage he had expected. The human's movements were becoming more confident and the gaps between firing positions were getting smaller. The champion decided to switch tactics and drew his melee weapons instead. This decision played directly into Jake's strengths. The human had been waiting for the opportunity to engage in close combat where his training advantages would be most effective. As Kratzon approached with two energy swords crackling in his hands, Jake prepared for the kind of fight he understood best. The melee combat was unlike anything the arena had seen before. Kratzon's four arms allowed him to attack from multiple angles simultaneously while maintaining perfect balance and defense. His energy swords created a deadly barrier of cutting force that should have been impossible to penetrate, but Jake had trained specifically for this scenario. Human military doctrine included extensive preparation for fighting opponents with multiple limbs or unusual weapon configurations. The Marine had spent months practicing against mechanical sparring partners designed to simulate exactly this kind of multi-armed assault. Jake's counterattacks were surgical in their precision. He exploited the brief moments when Kratzon's upper and lower arms interfered with each other's movement. The champion's four-armed coordination was normally an overwhelming advantage, but it also created complex timing requirements that could be disrupted by the right tactics the human used. The arena's barriers and obstacles to create angles that confused Kratzon's defensive positioning. Energy swords that were perfectly positioned to block attacks from the front became liabilities when Jake approached from unexpected directions. The champion found himself fighting an opponent who seemed to understand Kralix's combat doctrine better than he did. Captain Foster provided quiet commentary to General Vexthal as they watched the fight develop. Sergeant Morrison studied every piece of combat footage featuring Kralix warriors that we could obtain. He has been preparing specifically for this type of opponent. The implications of this statement hit Vexthal like a physical blow. The human had not just happened to develop effective tactics during the fight. He had trained for months or possibly years to counter Kralix's fighting techniques. This was not adaptation during combat, but the execution of a pre-planned strategy. "You have been preparing to fight my people," Vexthal said with a mixture of admiration and concern. "We have been preparing to fight any species that might pose a threat," Captain Foster replied. "It is standard military practice for us to study potential opponents and develop appropriate countermeasures." The fight reached its climax when Jake managed to trap one of Kratzon's energy swords against an arena barrier. The human used his smaller size to get inside the champion's reach where the longer weapons became a disadvantage. A series of precise strikes to nerve clusters along the Kralix warrior's arms caused him to drop his remaining weapons. Kratzen was not finished and attempted to use his superior strength to overpower the human in hand-to-hand combat. But Jake had studied Krallick's anatomy and knew exactly where to apply leverage to neutralize the size advantage. A perfectly executed throw sent the massive champion crashing to the arena floor. The arena fell completely silent as Kratzen struggled to rise and failed. The greatest Krallick's warrior of his generation had been defeated by a human who appeared to be nothing special by his own species' standards. The implications were staggering. Jake stood in the center of the arena as the victor of the warriors. Trial was announced. He did not celebrate or show any emotion beyond professional satisfaction. The human Marine had simply done his job and done it well. General Vexthel found himself applauding despite his shock at the outcome. The human had earned his respect through superior preparation and tactical thinking. But beneath that respect was a growing understanding that the galaxy had just changed in a fundamental way. The age of warriors who relied on natural advantages was ending. The age of warriors who succeeded through preparation and adaptability had begun. And humanity appeared to be very good at this new kind of warfare. The victory ceremony for the warriors' trial was unlike any that had been held before. Jake Morrison stood on the winner's platform while representatives from dozens of alien species watched in stunned silence. The human Marine accepted his trophy with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the tournament. He saluted the crowd once and then stepped down to rejoin his delegation. General Vexthel made his way through the crowd toward the human representatives. The Krallick's commander moved slowly as he processed what he had witnessed. His champion Kratzen was recovering in the medical bay with injuries to his pride more than his body. The defeat had shaken the foundation of everything Vexthel believed about military superiority. Colonel Webb, the general said as he approached the human delegation, I would like to request a private meeting with your team. There are matters we should discuss. Colonel Webb nodded politely. Of course, General, we would be honored to meet with you. 2 hours later, they gathered in a conference room aboard the Krallick's dreadnought Void Render. The chamber was designed to intimidate visitors with its high ceilings and displays of conquered worlds. But the humans seemed unimpressed by the show of power as they took their seats around the massive table. General Vexthel studied the three humans carefully. Colonel Webb carried herself with the quiet confidence of an experienced commander. Captain Foster had the alert demeanor of a diplomat accustomed to dealing with alien cultures. Sergeant Morrison sat with perfect military posture and waited for orders like the professional soldier he was. Your warrior fought exceptionally well today, Vexthel began carefully. But I must ask a direct question. Was this performance typical of human military capability? The three humans exchanged glances before Colonel Webb answered. General, with respect, Sergeant Morrison is a good soldier, but he is not exceptional by our standards. He represents approximately the 60th percentile of our active military personnel. The implications of this statement hit Vexthel like a physical blow. The human who had defeated the greatest warriors from multiple species was considered average by his own people. You mean there are many humans who fight better than him? About 40% of our military would score higher. In combat evaluations, Captain Foster confirmed. Sergeant Morrison was selected for this mission because of his tactical knowledge and ability to remain calm under pressure, not because he was our best fighter. Vexthel felt something cold settle in his stomach. How many humans serve in your military forces? Approximately 200 million across all branches and planetary defense forces. Colonel Webb replied matter-of-factly. The numbers were staggering. The Krallick's empire spanning 12-star systems maintained 50 million warriors total. Earth's single system apparently maintained 4 times that number in active military service. And if Morrison represented average capability, then the humans had tens of millions of soldiers who could potentially defeat elite alien warriors. But surely, Vexthel struggled to understand, your species must be naturally born for warfare like the Gorvani or the Thekmori. Actually, no, Sergeant Morrison spoke for the first time since entering the room. I was an accountant before I enlisted 3 years ago. Captain Foster was a school teacher and Colonel Webb studied agricultural science. Most of our military personnel come from civilian backgrounds. You were what? Vexthel could not hide his shock. An accountant, sir, Morrison repeated. I worked with financial records and tax documents. When the military began expanding after first contact with alien species, I decided to enlist and serve my planet. The concept seemed impossible to Vexthel. In Kralik society, warriors were born to their role and trained from hatching. The idea that a civilian could transform themselves into an effective soldier was foreign to his understanding of military organization. How long did your training take? He asked. Basic military training was 6 months, Morrison replied. Advanced combat training was another year. I have been studying alien combat techniques for the past 18 months since we learned about the warrior's trial. Captain Foster activated a holographic display showing human military doctrine. General, our military philosophy is based on the assumption that any individual can become an effective soldier if they are properly trained and motivated. We do not rely on natural-born warriors because we believe that dedication and preparation are more valuable than inherent ability. The display showed training programs that were completely different from anything Vexthel had seen before. Human soldiers learned to fight against opponents who might be stronger, faster, or possess unknown abilities. They studied the combat techniques of every known species and developed countermeasures for theoretical enemies that might not even exist. You prepare for everything, Vexthel observed. We prepare for anything we can imagine, and then we prepare for things we cannot imagine yet, Colonel Webb corrected. Our military academies run constant simulations against hypothetical opponents with various advantages over human capabilities. This revelation disturbed Vexthel more than anything else he had learned. The humans were not just studying known alien species, but actively developing tactics against enemies they had never encountered. Their entire military structure was designed around the assumption that they would always be fighting superior opponents. Your species has been part of the Galactic community for only 3 years, Vexthel said slowly. Yet your soldier knew exactly how to defeat my champion. We have been studying every piece of combat footage and tactical information we could obtain about Kralik's military doctrine, Morrison admitted. It seemed like useful knowledge to have. Captain Foster brought up more data on the holographic display. We have similar studies for every major species in the galaxy. Our military analysts examine fighting techniques, equipment capabilities, and tactical preferences. We develop training programs to counter each species' natural advantages. The scope of human preparation was breathtaking. They had been systematically analyzing every potential opponent in the galaxy and developing specific countermeasures. What other species considered natural superiority, the humans treated as problems, to be solved through training and tactics? This changes everything, Vexthel said quietly. How so, General? Colonel Webb asked. For thousands of years, galactic warfare has been dominated by species with natural advantages. The strong conquered the weak and superior biology determined victory, but you represent something completely different. You achieve military effectiveness through preparation rather than genetics. The conversation continued for several more hours as Vexthel learned about human military history and philosophy. The humans had been fighting continuously throughout their recorded history, but they had also been constantly improving their methods. Each conflict taught them new lessons that were incorporated into future training. Most disturbing was their approach to potential threats. Where other species prepared to fight enemies they had already encountered, humans prepared to fight enemies that might exist someday. Their military planning included scenarios that seemed impossible, but they developed tactics for them anyway. As the meeting drew to a close, Vexthel made a request that surprised even himself. I would like to arrange military exchanges between our peoples. Perhaps some of your training methods could benefit Kralik's warriors. The humans agreed to consider the proposal, and the meeting ended with formal diplomatic courtesies. But as Vexthel watched the human delegation return to their ship, he understood that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The age of natural warriors was ending. Species could no longer rely on biological advantages to guarantee military success. The humans had proven that proper preparation and tactical thinking could overcome any natural superiority. Back in the human quarters, Jake Morrison was already reviewing combat footage from the tournament. Not to celebrate his victories, but to identify mistakes he had made and areas where his performance could be improved. Because that was what humans did. They never stopped learning, never stopped preparing, never stopped getting better. The final scene showed General Vexthal standing at the observation deck watching the human ship depart Kepler Station. For the first time in his military career, he felt something he had never experienced before. Not fear exactly, but a profound respect for what dedication and preparation could accomplish. The galaxy would never be the same because humanity had arrived and they were very good at the one thing that mattered most in warfare. They were very good at learning how to win.